I have a lot to get through because unfortunately when I put together the abstract I had 3 ideas and those became probably a dozen, and there's actually, I've excluded most of them. There's actually 50 slides in this deck which we are not going to get to. So we're going to start with lessons from history. Is there a laser pointer here? Maybe? Maybe? No, okay. Basically the idea is if you have a space settlement, I'm going to kind of model this on what's happened over the last 500 years. You start out with the settlement, you have finished goods coming from the source civilization, your basic machinery and so forth, and then at the destination you have your in situ resources, your food, your water, your shelter. What this led to in the colonial era was they wanted to maintain an economic model in Britain that was favorable to Britain, in France to France, in Spain to Spain. So you could only trade with your other civilizations within your sphere. So you could only trade with British colonies or with Britain. You could only buy finished goods from Britain that were of high quality. So you had situations where George Washington, about 10, 15 years before the Revolution, was ordering a carriage. And he got the worst carriage that they made in England, and he got it 3 years late because why give him the good stuff when you've got references over in the House of Lords? So basically, you end up getting the dirty end of the stick on a lot of these things. The resource curse sort of grew out of that in the non-Anglo-spheric countries. In places like that were settled by Spain, the king owned the land. In the places settled by England, the individuals who colonized the place owned the land. So basically, this is part of the reason the English-speaking world became more prosperous, because you had individual ownership, individual responsibility, individual entrepreneurship that carried over into the post-colonial and independence era. Within these other countries, it was who knew the king, or in the case of a lot of these other countries, who was politically connected as the one who got access to the mining rights, the oil, and so forth. Resource curse is the idea of, if these countries have all these natural resources, why are the people poor, why are they uneducated, and why is there so much corruption? Whereas someplace like Singapore, which has almost no natural resources, it's very free, it's very well educated, and it's very prosperous. It doesn't make sense on paper, but this is the reason why. So after the mercantile era kind of fell apart and we had free trade and we had independence, we go into the free market era, the Adam Smith sort of era, and what this has led to is globalism. Globalism, basically, there's a wonderful essay called I, Pencil from about 40 years ago. The idea that a pencil has parts that were made in several different countries, in different places. These people don't necessarily know anything about each other. So we're talking about, oh, how do we build a city on Mars? How do we build a city on Mars when we can't even build a pencil in one country? That's the situation we're in. We've gotten so far away from that we're not thinking in those terms anymore. So I'm also going to talk briefly about diffusion of innovations and business cycles and so forth. I had a whole talk on this last year, but I'm just going to touch on this. You end up with a situation in aerospace. There was 66 years that separated Kitty Hawk from the Apollo 11 moon landing. It's been about 46 years since then, and we've not done anything remotely like that, because we started at the bottom of the curve and we ended at the top of the curve. And basically this is when all the low-hanging fruit are picked, and this is how every industrial revolution, every technology revolution is played out. Now it's being played out with computers. We went from Moore's law being every 2 years it doubles in capacity. They have this tick-tock arrangement at Intel where they would optimize one aspect of the computer chip, and then they would shrink them the following year. Now they've gone to a 3-year cycle instead of a 2-year cycle. So this stuff is starting to slow down. There's also another thing called Kondratyev Waves, which is the idea of each of these industrial and technological revolutions tends to follow a certain cycle, and these follow through. Well, what if there was a way to really kind of bottle this lightning? Because there is an advantage to these down cycles of creative destruction, of getting rid of the less performing industries, and basically kind of like when a drought hits your lawn and the weaker grass dies off. So one time I was trying to explain to my 7-year-old what money is. And most of what money is basically fiat currency. It's built on trust and central banks. It isn't backed by anything. If you want to get into something that's backed by something, that's precious metals. So you've got these infomercials about, oh, we can't trust this, we have to go to precious metals. And then there are actually situations like the fall of the Roman Empire where precious metals broke down. And they actually went completely to barter. And that's how the economy worked through the early Dark Ages. So this is basically the spectrum. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes this idea of cryptocurrency, of bitcoins, about 7 years ago. And this is something that is digital, but it's also scarce, because it's the equivalent to if I handed everybody a sheet of paper in the room, and I said, okay, everybody, write down, Kent gives Bob $100, and here's the serial number of the bill. And then we put all those in a pile. What happens is that if I try to print out 10 sheets and say I only gave him $50, the other sheets in the pile will outvote that. This is called a shared ledger. It's the idea that you can have a system without a central bank or without a central government that guarantees your currency. And there's also a thing called proof of work that allows these votes to essentially equalize out. And there's two forms of those. Bitcoin, which is basically a way to revolutionize finance by getting away from central currencies, and Ethereum, which gets away from centralized contracts. You actually write contracts within the money itself. So you don't buy a song off iTunes, you buy a song, and the money automatically goes to the artist and the drummer and whatever as part of that contract. So what if we combine solutions? This is an idea that was basically an early 20th century idea before economies of scale started to destroy it after World War II. It's the idea of distributism. Instead of having banks, labor unions, and investor-owned or stock market things, economies of scale and so forth, we have credit unions, which are owned by the people you have that are in it. Training guilds. You have basically the guild architecture came before the union architecture in medieval Europe. Employee-owned companies, distributed manufacture, 3D printing, all that wonderful stuff. And the middle class in a situation like this is stabilized because the means of production are centered around the individual or the family, or the guild on a larger scale, or the employee-owned company on the largest scale. You don't have the idea of the middle class exploited by the state in the case of the left, or the company in the case of the right. So what if we broke things into 7 guilds, just off the bat? We have a life science guild, an information guild, power, construction, transportation, and so forth. I'm kind of lumping the arts and sciences in one area, although I think the idea of a purely non-corporeal guild may be a little dangerous, because then you have people who aren't completely anchored to the physicality of what they do. But then let's say every 7 years we have a sort of sabbatical year. We reset copyright, patent law, and stuff like that, and it goes from owned by the individual groups to essentially open source within the settlement. And then out in a 14-year cycle, we do it outside the settlement. So you're still able to sell your stuff to Earth and so forth. You still have that import-export of information, of invention, so that we can encourage that sort of export economy on that. And then after 21 years, it becomes part of the historical record. Now, we don't want to reset the entire economy at once, and that's why part of the reason we broke it into 7 guilds is let's break each year, a different guild gets reset. So what that ends up being is you have this sort of, each guild is resetting in its year locally, and then it has a secondary reset where it resets its export market. That black line is the average. The average never goes negative. And the cumulative economy, which is the totals of all those, has a rather staggered pattern, so you still get that feed and weed sort of cycle, but it's a little jagged, but at least it's predictable. So you get the advantage of the Kondratyev waves in terms of keeping the economy robust, but you have the converse of that of a predictable cycle. And even if you kind of burn the whole thing down every 3 years, this is a very conservative thing, you still get exponential growth by the time you get to the end of the 50-year cycle. So that would be a good time, after 2 generations of new inhabitants, you could actually split the colony into different units. The other advantage of this is, let's say you wanted to work in more than one guild, you could essentially kind of hop to whichever one was going on the upswing. So your personal economy, your trading economy as far as your labor, your intelligence would never go negative under a circumstance like that. One of the things you want to do in a circumstance like this is if you can't have like all the farmers, if you have 100 people in a settlement and all the farmers die, everybody's going to die, even if there's only 2 farmers. So you need skills to be distributed evenly, and this encourages that to be able to, if I work in 1 guild or 2 guilds or all 7 guilds. There's the idea of a technology trap where, I have the cell phone, but I have no idea how it works. You can kind of get around that as well if people have a more broad polymath sort of attitude. What about the idea of spontaneous corporations? This is sort of like Kickstarter. I go on, I say I have a great idea for something, I get my investors up front, and then we go and do it. Well, what if we did that at a guild level where it's like, okay, I've got this idea, we need 20 manufacturing spaces, we need this stuff, we're going to get this profit. Who's in? Who wants to actually buy that product, whether it's a cell phone or a road or whatever? You could have an arrangement like that. You could bring in the resources as needed. You could do it by vote, essentially voting with your money, voting with your capital, or voting with your ability to buy the product at the end. And the advantage of this is you get away from the situation with companies where you have a really innovative guy who starts everything, and then after a while, he's out of ideas, his friends are out of ideas, and there's nobody running the company except MBAs and accountants. And that sort of, they forgot how to innovate. That's been happening with a lot of companies. And what if these projects are built around the idea that, well, what if we just build what we need when we need it, and then we can build a 2.0 if we think there's going to be room for a 2.0, but if there isn't, send the talent, send the capital, send everything where it needs to go. Diffuse it. So this is, what would your career path look like in a settlement like this? Well, once you're age 0 to age 7, we would have childhood literature. You would get your computer core. You could use that for Bitcoin mining or whatever, or otherwise distributing it. There's your allowance for the day. You would learn basic agricultural work because everybody's got to eat. You'd start your basic training on liberal arts and sciences and how to work on things. But you'd also start doing practical work. You would gain your ability to buy essentially your food production module, which would be 1 unit that would produce enough food for 1 person. It doesn't mean you're going to live off this module for the rest of your life, but this is what you're going to trade in and out of. So if your thing is an aquaponics module, if that's what you're into, then somebody else has a grain module, somebody else has something else. You're doing your little economy that way. By age 21, you've got your own habitat, and you can start setting up your thing. You can either work on an advanced degree within a guild or go on from there. And eventually, at the end, by age 28, do you want to go work in a different guild? Do you want to work in all 7 guilds? You can do that by age 63. You can have spent 7 years in each guild. That's why that number 7 works really efficiently for this. So it corresponds to a human lifetime. If we extend human lifetimes, we can kick that out as well. If you're a new arrival from Earth or whatever, we kind of have a truncated version of this, but by year 8, you're off to the races. And we would want a guild to sponsor you coming over. We would want somebody to say, that guy's worth bringing in, let's bring him in, that sort of arrangement. So we get rid of the fiat currency on this end. We have blockchain tracking of physical goods. So one of the things they're doing now with blockchain has gone beyond currency. It's things like diamond markets. They can take about 150 parameters of a mined diamond and put them into a blockchain that's distributed everywhere. One of the problems is China's been making synthetic diamonds and certifying them as if they were real diamonds, as mined diamonds. So basically this gets away from that. So the way they've done that is they use a blockchain, and everybody has a copy of this diamond, has this public key, and therefore we know that this is an actual diamond because all its parameters have been computed. So this gets away from the idea of property theft. This is a way of tracking who owns what. And then if you had that contractual debt of you just came over or whatever, then that's part of your Ethereum contract of your employment. So this, we strip this down to a sort of a basic. We still could have specie currency, ironically. You could still have gold coins because mining blockchain currency takes a lot of electrical current. Well, what if we had, instead of proof of digital work, what if we had proof of practical work? You say, that's all nice and everything, but I really need you to compute this cosmic ray shielding model for this thing. Let me send out blocks for that, and I'll just pay you when it's done. We can get away from the, so I kind of expressed what contracts would be. They would be very simplified. So that gets away from regulation models. We could have something like Underwriters Labs is actually a private company, but it basically does, you send in your product, they do all kinds of incredible testing to it, they show that it works or doesn't work, and then you get your little UL certification. So you can maintain the safety of products within a market like this by contract rather than by government. You could also have what the FAA does is it's a mixed model, but it's a lot better than most things we have. Because for an aircraft to require a new regulation, it has to actually have a problem. If there's no problem, there's no new regulation. But if there's a problem with a carburetor on a Cessna 150 and they go and fix it, then every Cessna 150 within the fleet of Cessna 150s has to be fixed by the time of the next annual certification, otherwise it doesn't fly. So you only fix on failure. You don't have that, you know, it's another year, I've got to have something to do, I'm going to write another 1,000 pages of regulation. And then if we had, the other problem is we have, what, 24,000 pages of tax law. Everybody's a felon because nobody knows what's in it. If you had like 1,000 pages of standard law, which was, I think, the thickness of my business law book in college, where you know that, you know, you graduate the equivalent to high school knowing that, and then you have 500 within your specialty, like pharmaceuticals or whatever, and then as you go further up the tree, you get smaller and smaller until you're down to the size of a magazine or a wall poster, then you can kind of prevent that unconditional spread of regulation. So we've fixed the economic model, we've fixed the money system, we've fixed the career path system. It's not boring anymore. You have the ability to shift careers very easily. We've limited the scope of government to an absolute minimum. We've minimized the opportunities for graft, for fraud, and we have an absolute minimum number of corporate and government BARC residents, if you recognize your Hitchhiker's Guide. And the things that would still need to be worked out is how many people go in each guild. Well, there might be more in construction than in, say, making music. You know, what is a good detailed resource model, labor model, and so forth. This would probably be, if somebody was a game designer, a good foundation for building something. Because then a lot of that is really just economics. You know, what are the technology growth projections? How much of this labor is actually going to be done by machines in the long run? Because we have a robotics revolution that's just starting to happen that's really going to disrupt the labor market. And then habitat, what's the size of a habitat starter kit or a living space or a food space or whatever? And that's about it. Any questions? Yes.
This is a kind of macro question. Within most economic systems, there's some sort of mechanism of competition, so you have basically Darwinian evolution of systems. But economic systems themselves also compete. And this is very interesting, very curious. It's like some nice ideas, but are they competitive with existing, like, raw capitalist stuff? How will you prevent people just making deals on the side, which seems to destabilize it? And like, are you planning to enforce it? Enforce everyone to use the system? It seems to have more friction than traditional methods of exchange.
I'm not sure if you're going to do a deal on the side. How do you mean? Outside of the system, there's really no motivation for that because if you're doing peer-to-peer contracting, everything's on the side. I mean, what do you mean by getting out of that system?
I mean,
there is no side. It's all side.
Let's say you want to do more than one guild at once, or you know, like
yeah, that's exactly that's allowed. That's encouraged because I want somebody in the life sciences guild to be working with people in the construction guild because that's how you get biomimicry. I want somebody in the software guild also working in the life sciences guild so we can have better
why
software.
Hasn't something like this emerged naturally on in a competitive way already?
Because there's a convergence of technologies, some of which have only emerged in the last year, with philosophies and ideas that kind of died out about 50 years ago. I'm trying to pull the links together.
Okay, but if we can work on Mars, I'm saying we should be able to work on Earth, at least somewhere.
The ideal place for this actually is Indian reservations, because they are isolated and have a tragedy of the commons issue that's keeping them poor. Yes?
You know, I just think there's some interesting ideas here. Your idea of sort of like polymathic work and people doing many different careers, I mean, it seems to be flying straight to the face of development nations, right? Where Smith, the diplomatist at the beginning, describes the advantages of specialization.
There are advantages to specialization if you have a large enough population. When you're first starting out, you can't really do that. Once you, but you can stay in one guild your whole career, and that's actually a pretty good career option too. Yes?
My daughter in high school, in college, went down to Mexico to a city that everybody's making too many burritos. And so they all got together and said, we're gonna only make this many burritos, and then everyone cheated. So they still had the same problem, but now they said they should have been doing it differently.
So they are now in charge of OPEC?
But I don't know how you solve that. I think there's just something.
Well, the thing about the space settlement issue is that you're only going to be able to drink so much water. There's going to be an incentive for luxury goods beyond the basics. You know, what we had this conversation yesterday is I'm not going to Mars until we can grow coffee there. So it's once you get past a certain point, the amount you need to survive versus the amount of there's going to be a profit on that. And that's where the profit motive is going to be, is going past subsistence and into stability and civilization. Yes.
So from having worked with this kind of years ago, there seemed to be one thing that I found as a 20% the definition that there is an infinite race to use energy to keep the system going. And what about that?
That's actually one issue with this. I think you'd need to have a near unlimited power source to some degree. Not unlimited, but that's why I said proof of practical work, because that bugs me. I'd like to, and that's why I said you're not going to get away from the gold coin issue, because a gold coin, once it's minted, it doesn't require any further energy. So you may have an internal economy that is largely gold coins and proof of practical work, and then you're using Bitcoin for more, I've got to send something to the moon. What do I do to settleize that transaction? The other fun thing is how do you do a shared ledger across the solar system when it takes hours? And I've got another solution for that, but that's buried in those slides that I'm not talking about.
I'm assuming that when the first settlers get up there, there is no need for currency, right? You're kind of like roommates and you're sharing the chores and you've got common groceries and things like that. So at what point in population density up there do you see the need to have a currency?
I think you need a trading system to some degree anyway. And on the space station, they actually have something like Microsoft Project, except it also budgets power, because it's not just labor and hours on an experimental thing. It also how much electricity does this take, because the solar panels and batteries only make so much power. So they already have a currency of how many power units, how many watts, or how many hours, or whatever. So you'll have that sort of barter at the existential level that can then be represented by currency at a higher level once you get to the point where that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
What happens when a project fails? So, like, they say, hey, we want you to build this thing that's going to, allow us to go do this other thing that somebody else is working on. So, at the end of the project, I'm going to give you, X amount of whatever. The person works on that for a year and a half, and all of a sudden finds out it can't work or it fails or whatever. How does
That's kind of the part of the risk pool. I mean, that's a good question, because you may have a retarder on innovation if people are only going to do the safe route. I'm trying to put as much in as possible to encourage technological advancement at the same time as stability, and those are two mutually competing things. If you try something great, you need a very smart culture to know that's not going to work before I'm going to put my money into it. But some people are going to know that ahead of time. Some people are not going to realize that until afterwards. It's just how, humans are just fallible machines. So, and I think there was one, that was you again.
I mean, it's sort of more broadly, I guess that brings up the question, isn't the entire purpose of the wage systems to sort of insure against that sort of failure risk, right? That if you want to make profits, then you take the
Yeah, you take the risk, yeah.
failure. And if you really prefer to make sure that you don't work for 2 years and end up with nothing, then you go and get a job where the person pays you on a weekly or monthly basis.
Well, and that's part of the reason I say, okay, first you have your own food, and then you have your own, so you're not going to starve if any of these things go off. You're independently wealthy enough to at least feed yourself and shelter yourself. If you fail, if every project you propose after that is a failure, and you're not selected for anything, then you're going to have problems. But at least you can still feed and clothe yourself. So I think we're done, and I think we're out of time.
Actually, I have one more real quick.
Oh, sure, one more.
How is this any different from a minimum basic income?
It's very different because it's not just minimum basic income. It's you have to earn that minimum basic income. There's another, again, I'll refer you to my presentation from a few years ago. The idea that a high school will basically, you're not just studying, and one of my problems is, when am I ever going to use this? If I'm doing a geometry problem in the morning and then I'm applying it in the practicum lab in the afternoon, am I child slave labor, or am I actually earning something towards my graduation? So if you're graduating the equivalent to high school, college, whatever, with your ability to feed and shelter yourself, and run computational work, you have your minimum basic income. Beyond that, and then there's probably going to be like a guild insurance system if you have a child who's developmentally disabled or whatever. You don't want to starve them out. So I think that's everything, and I think that's all my time. So we're good.